we get a call from the guy because he's actually talking on cellular telephone with one of the negotiators and basically says, if my phone dies, I die, and I have 3% battery left. So my commander asked me, are we able to carry a payload with the aircraft?
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 144. What are we learning about how drones can be used for public safety? If you ask today's guest, he'd run off a list of best practices. Mike Uleski is an officer with the Daytona Beach Shrs Public Safety Department. He has a private pilot's license, earning it before graduating high school. At Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, Mike earned a bachelor's degree in aeronautical sciences. He also has a commercial pilot certificate with ratings for instrument flight, single-engine, and multi-engine aircraft. In addition to being a patrol division sergeant, Mike is also cross-trained as a law enforcement officer, firefighter, and EMT. He is also the chief public safety instructor at Dart Drones. Additionally, Mike has more than 17 years of experience building and flying remote-controlled aircraft, including fixed-wing, helicopters, and multirotors. Under Mike's supervision, the Daytona Beach Shrs Public Safety Department has been using drones in their operations for over a year. In this edition of the Drone Radio Show, Mike talks about 4 cases where drones were used by his department, the lessons learned, and what public safety officials should consider when creating their own drone program. Now, before we hear from Mike, I want to thank those of you who continue to support my funding campaign on Patreon. For as little as $1 per month, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to patreon.com/drone radio show to join the team. Now let's explore some public safety case studies with Mike Uleski of the Daytona Beach Shrs Public Safety Department. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Mike to introduce himself.
My name is Mike Uleski. My day job is I'm a public safety officer for the city of Daytona Beach Shrs in Daytona Beach Shrs, Florida. And we're a little bit different. We are public safety, and with that, we're actually cross-certified. So all of our full-time officers, including myself, we're actually cross-certified as a law enforcement officer, firefighter, and EMT as well. So that's my day job, and definitely it's different. The jobs don't necessarily equal each other. It's definitely different amongst them.
How long have you been working with the department?
Been with the department now since 2010. I actually started when I was 30. It's a second career for me. I originally was in aviation. That was my first career up until 2008, 2009 when we saw the economic downturn in aviation. So I decided to look into something else, and that's how I actually ended up in public safety.
What did you do in aviation?
I was a research and development projects manager, and I was able to go and get into more of an engineering role, and I was designing aircraft upgrades and parts, mostly for general aviation and business aviation aircraft. So our goal was to bring in a older 172 and older Piper and then upgrade it to LED lighting, electroluminescent lighting. We would replace plastic with new types of fiberglass, aramids, composites. So essentially, we could take an older aircraft and then rehab it into something that would be more what we have available on modern 2010, 2012 type aircraft.
Is the department now using drones on a regular basis?
Yes, it's definitely become a regular part of our day-to-day operations, which is pretty much where we were looking to be. And it has definitely gained support amongst our supervisors and administrators. And the nice thing is now that they have an understanding of what capabilities we have, they have a better role in call outs because we still do have it set up that administration or supervisor is required to go and actually have the drone deployed. We can kind of influence that decision and give them information as to, we have it available, this is what we can do for a day-to-day basis, but it makes it nicer when they actually call you and say, okay, we got this situation. We need the UAS unit. This is what we need.
How did drones find their way into the agency's operations?
I've been a long time RC enthusiast. I've been flying RC for 20 plus years. And then more recently, I got into the FPV racing drones and then FPV aerial photography and then more into the commercial side. It actually started in 2016 when we had Hurricane Matthew coming towards the Daytona Beach area. And at that point in time, we had a briefing on what operations were going to take place. And most of my department knew that I was the drone guy, and we hadn't actually brought it in, but it had been talked about. And they said, are you able to operate this after the hurricane, mostly for damage assessment, search and rescue? Of course, yeah, I was already 107 certified, so we actually operated underneath of my 107 certificate versus a certificate of authorization, and everything else was already in place. I had a good relationship with Daytona Beach International Airport, so they were willing to work with us. And this was also before the dreaded airspace portal even existed, thankfully. So we were able to call up the tower at that point in time. And we flew for Hurricane Matthew. And our city is not very large. We're mostly a beachside community along the Atlantic Ocean. So we're about 7 miles long, but our total area is only about 0.79 square miles. So total area is relatively small. But after the hurricane, I was tasked with assisting the building department in doing damage assessment. This was flying an older Phantom 3 Advanced, which was one of my first true drones. And we were able to clear the entire city in about 2 hours. And that was doing not high definition. We were looking more for speed, and then we would go back and get high definition later. But we were able to do that. But what really kicked it off was that with our community, once the winds get over 50 miles an hour, we close the bridges. We actually hard block them. And we have a huge amount that evacuate. Very, very few people stay. So afterwards, we don't reopen the bridges until we're able to go through the city and make sure that it's safe. We don't have power lines down. And we had a lot of very frustrated residents contacting us through our Facebook page because they wanted to see what happened. They were stuck on the mainland and all they could do is look across the river. So my lieutenant actually had me go and put together a short promo video drawn from our damage assessment video, which was already done. And we posted it on Facebook, and it just went absolutely viral for the city. Everyone was able to see their house, the businesses, the roadways, and it made them feel a lot better that our city was still there and it was still intact.
Refresh our memory. When did Hurricane Matthew strike your area?
September 2016. Actually, I believe our first flight operations was September 10th. We flew the day after. Once we were able to get everything basically stabilized was when we decided to start flight operations, and that was when I went out and started doing the surveys.
Did you have to file any after-action reports when using the drones?
At that point in time, as we found, there's very little requirement as to what is required by legislation or policy. We're kind of making it up as we go. And we did decide that we would go, and anytime, and this is carried on even through our operations today, is at any time that we carry out an operation that draws a case report. So basically anything that we're going to actually write a report on, any operation that involves the UAS, there has to be a specific report written by the pilot in command as to what was done, what was collected, how the evidence was handled, what we did with it. And we kind of started the ball rolling there because we're kind of coming up with this, not necessarily on the fly, because we're following manned aviation. And we're kind of trying to go into that so that we can keep it in a professional setting. But we're kind of coming up with what is best practices. And especially from the sheer fact of being able to debrief and look back and say, this is what worked, this is what hasn't, because we're dealing with such a new technology, we're going to find things that don't work. And we're going to find things that work great. And without those after action reports where we can sit back and reflect a day later, a week later, and say, boy, if we only had this would have went a lot better. Now we can actually say, this is what the report said, this is what we're going to do the next time. And then in that next report, it may reflect, we changed our operations, we changed this policy. This is what we're now doing based upon these learning events that we've had previously.
So looking back, what worked and what didn't?
We did follow all of the 107 rules. I had a spotter with me. I'd actually called up Daytona International Airport and requested a temporary flight restriction. There weren't a whole lot of flights, obviously, because of the nature of it, but we were more worried about sightseeing aircraft coming into the area. And the north end of my city is in Daytona Class Charlie airspace, all the way down to the surface. So for the most part, it's relatively well regulated, being controlled airspace. And at one point in time, my spotter and I was performing operations in between a set of condos. And we have condos on the river side, and then we have condos on the beach side. They're separated probably about a half mile. And I was well beyond the condo tops. I was probably 100 feet below them. And all of a sudden, my spotter calls out, you have a helicopter coming up from the south. And here comes a MD-500 helicopter. And he's probably 150 feet above the ground, maybe 200. Comes right into the area. I know he's lower than the condo, so he's probably not even being picked up on radar by Daytona. But there he is. So we immediately went and got down onto the deck as low as we could, got low, recovered the aircraft. The helicopter came into the area and was present for maybe about 10 or 15 minutes. And then it eventually left to the south again. But it was kind of a hard lesson of, especially in the UAS side, where from a right-of-way standpoint, we have to avoid all manned aircraft. There's lives that are at stake in that. Whether they're doing right or wrong, we have to protect ourselves. So that was kind of one of those lessons that we can take a lot of precautions, but you still need that visual spotter there to be able to watch your back. Because I'm flying head down. I'm watching the screen and I'm watching for damage and what I need to look for. Thankfully, he had his eyes up doing his job, and he was able to spot the traffic coming in. Beyond that, the imagery was beautiful. Even with an older Phantom 3, we were able to get exactly what we needed. The building department was thrilled because for us, especially with the condos, they would have had to go to the roof of every single one of those condos to do an inspection. So you can kind of imagine how long that would take. We were able to deliver them data to where they could actually pinpoint which buildings needed attention and which ones could wait until later for a closer in inspection.
How did the use of drones evolve from that first case with Matthew to becoming part of the daily operation?
Pretty much after that, the city council was absolutely blown away with what we were able to do with it. Most of them didn't even realize what kind of technology was available. They'd only seen drones in Best Buy, and they know that they fly around the condos and they bother people, but they never actually had that mindset of what these can be used for in a constructive sense. And at that point in time, the beautiful thing was that my chief was absolutely 100% supportive of the development of the program. So he gave me carte blanche to go and do whatever needed to be done to actually get a true professional program up and running. So we started with a basic proposal because it does have to be approved through our city council. So I put together a proposal going over the positives of what UAS technology has, the risk mitigation, the requirements for training, certification. It turned into, I think, about a 45-page document by the time I was done with it. But we took that to the city council. It was approved unanimously without any real effort. And from there, we started actually looking at more serious equipment. That was when we went shopping for something that was a little more capable. We did end up with an Inspire 1, which I also own personally, so I knew its capabilities as well. So we moved into that, and my chief was also very adamant that he wanted thermal capability, so we now have that as well. And it kind of rolled from there. And the thing is, there's not really a whole lot of equipment that's required. Once you get up and going, you have your equipment that you need. There's not a whole lot of overhead that comes beyond it. You have what you need, you're established. So equipment-wise was actually the easiest side. The paperwork side was the other half.
What do you mean by the paperwork?
The paperwork side, sadly, it's probably about 10% flying and 90% paperwork. The guys that I've trained, they've found that kind of the hard way because everything that we do is new. So we're kind of working our way through what do we need to document? How do we need to document it? The forms are basically being created upon what we are requiring. And it's kind of difficult. There are a lot of internet communities to go out there and find stuff. But for the most part, we're still left to kind of come up with what we want on our own because there's not a whole lot of requirements out there. It's more industry best practices. So from us, the very beginning started with writing our standard operating procedures manual that goes over when we can deploy, who's allowed to deploy it, what kind of training they have to have, certifications. And for the most part, my agency, we follow Part 107. So thankfully, we were able to pull a lot of the information from Part 107 to go and set the limitations that we're able to do. Once we got done with the standard operating procedures manual, that was when I really started into the training manual because we found learning how to fly it is only a small portion of the entire picture, especially in public safety. It's a little bit different than a commercial operator where they can look at it. The weather's a little off. The visibility is a little less than they want, but still legal. They may be able to pass that off to another day. For us, especially when we're looking at something as a life or death type issue, the pilots need to be a little bit more on their game. They have to be very competent and very confident in what they're doing, because what they are doing very well may mean the difference between life and death. So we do have a rather rigorous training program. And for me, I follow manned aviation, which my background comes in handy because we actually have a process where they go through a basic flight training module and an emergency procedures manual module. Now they move on to an actual solo authorization where they have to go through a phase check, and there are certain maneuvers that they're expected to go out there and do. So then that way I can see that they have the necessary skills to move forward. Then we move into advanced operations from there. So from start to finish, it probably takes us roughly about 3 months. Even though a pilot comes in 107 certified, they're required to have that, but that's only a knowledge exam. That only gives them the basic knowledge to be able to operate in this industry. Now we need to go into industry specific. Typically, from standpoint of someone who just starts, it's going to take several months to get them up to the point where they're actually competent and confident, especially for these type of operations.
In regard to the training for your pilots, did you find it through a vendor or did you develop an in-house training program on your own?
We developed our training in-house, and that was primarily because I was able to use my previous aviation experience to go and look at what do we need these individuals to know and how do we need them to fly to maintain safety. So from there were some companies out there, and for us, especially because public safety, the way we fly is a little bit different than other industries, it was a lot easier for me to just develop the skills that I saw necessary rather than to just give them a general basic flight program and then have to treat it as we're going to teach you operational afterwards. So we started from the very beginning as you're going to be a public safety pilot. This is what's required.
Okay, let's move on to another case study.
The second case study is kind of an interesting one, and it wasn't necessarily the UAS and the flight that was mostly the strange part of it. It was more dealing with state legislation that we have in Florida. So this was a situation where night before, it was not our city directly, but it was in proximity. We had a couple car breaks, so a couple cars got broken into. During that, we found out that a couple firearms were stolen, so it was a rather serious case at that point in time. They actually used the helicopter to come over and try searching for them. It was unsuccessful. So the next day, I got a call that the sheriff's office, whose jurisdiction took the car breaks, had located an iPad using the Find My iPad app and traced it back to one of the hotels within our city. So out front of this hotel room, there were two cars. One was a Corvette, the other one was a Hyundai. And they required especially this license plate off of the Hyundai because it was believed that it was involved in the crimes, but they weren't quite sure. So I went to the location where they asked me to meet, and it was probably 700 feet away from the location, so I was a little distance. And they said, we need you to fly over there. We need to get this license plate. Well, Florida, we have to deal with something called the Unwarranted Surveillance Act. Came out in July of 2015, and it limits the UAS use for law enforcement specifically. And we're allowed to use it, but it has to be under either a warrant or what we call an exigent circumstance. And that's pretty much fleeing suspect, destruction of evidence, someone is going to be severely injured or killed if something happens. So they were in the process of getting the warrant when all of a sudden these individuals started to come out and they were milling around. We were worried that if they did leave, we would lose them at that point. So I learned after the fact that since they were involved in the car breaks, which is how they traced the iPad, but also these same individuals were captured on video several nights prior committing a home invasion burglary where they were actually armed. So I started talking with the state attorney's office, and I will say this, they have absolutely no idea what really the law means, which is kind of difficult because they haven't dealt with it. So we were able to articulate that because these individuals were armed, we knew that they were involved in that. we knew that they had propensity for violence, that we fell underneath of exigent circumstance that they could potentially flee if we did not get the information we needed. So the aircraft selected was the DJI Mavic, primarily because we needed something that was a little bit quieter than our Inspire 1. And I was able to fly over, cross the road, drop down. We used the 2x digital zoom that was available, pulled off the license plate, went back up to about 150, 200 feet of altitude, stayed overhead. We ran the license plate, and sure enough, the Hyundai was a stolen car. About 20 minutes later, the individuals came out. We did a takedown in the parking lot, and sure enough, it was the same individuals. We recovered several guns, other stolen property that was taken. But that was an interesting case because the flight was honestly the easiest part of the entire thing. It was fly across the road, drop down, and get the license plate. It's all the other stuff that comes with it, understanding how the case laws work, which sadly we don't have much. There's not a whole lot of precedent. We're kind of making the precedent. So with that one, it was a very good outcome. It worked out very well, especially using interagency, because I was actually operating for the sheriff's office, even though it was underneath of my agency. And we ended up getting the criminals off the street, which was the end goal in the end.
How does the new law affect what you can do with the drone?
It was written in 2015, and for the most part in the UAS industry, that's almost a lifetime ago. So the technology has changed, the perception of the technology has changed, but it was essentially put out there because there was a large worry amongst the public of privacy issues. That was where the law came from. And especially in the realm of law enforcement, they did not want us playing Big Brother, where we would start actually patrolling the skies using drones rather than ground-based in a patrol car. So they created this law. It was rather quickly put together, and it was just to protect privacy, not necessarily look at what can we use this for. We're just going to close it off for a safety aspect. It also covers general use on the civil side. And essentially, if you go and spy on your neighbors and you cause damages to them, that they are able to go and sue you civilly. It's not a criminal. There's nothing criminal in it. But what it did do was limit what we can do in law enforcement, which makes it difficult because if we do get good evidence, even though it was captured by a drone, the defense attorney could have it thrown out simply underneath of the fact that we're not allowed to use a drone to gather certain types of evidence.
So you can't gather evidence until you've determined that a crime has been committed or that there's a reason for the search.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, we call them the exigent circumstances. And for the most part, that's going to be where if we don't do something in swift action, there's going to be a significant threat to the public or the potential that the suspect is going to get away.
From that success, did you begin to look at how you could apply what you've learned to other law enforcement situations?
Oh, definitely. And the difficulty that we have, though, is since every single incident is different, it's very hard to cookie cutter and say that if this happens, we are going to do this. And that's what makes public safety so different, is that we're fluid. It may change based upon the moment. So you really have to be able to go and take into account what those changes could be and pre-plan as best you can. But sometimes you're just on the fly, and we just keep with the whole safety first, mission second. So then that way, at least we maintain that air of safety. But you have to be really flexible and be able to do something that may not be necessarily within your comfort zone, but that you're competent and you're able to accomplish it in a safe manner.
In a third case study, the drone was actually used to track down a suspect. Tell us about that.
This is really where UAS and drones come into their own for law enforcement. This is a very common scenario. A couple of our officers conducted a traffic stop. Upon the car pulling over, passenger jumped out of the passenger seat, took off running. Obviously, we took up chase from there, but in a suburban, urban environment, it's difficult to go and actually chase someone down. So we quickly got up a perimeter, which is standard for us. So we had a north perimeter, south perimeter, and then we also had a little bit of coverage east and west. My supervisor, he basically said, okay, we need the UAS. So I went to a location that was away from the perimeter. So then that way I wasn't in the middle of things, but I was able to go and get the aircraft into the operational area where I could maintain visual line of sight and all the other requirements per 107. So the incident started at 10:28 a.m. That was when the car initially stopped and the passenger fled. I was able to get on scene and have the aircraft in the air within 5 minutes of that occurring. As soon as I launched, I went directly over to where the last location that we had of where the subject was seen, and I took up an overwatch position. So basically, I was hovering at altitude over the position, so then that way, if anything got out of that perimeter, I would be able to tell ground units and adjust the perimeter as necessary. So I'm on overwatch, and I'm telling them I don't see the subject. He must be in the building somewhere. We were actually able to send our units into the building, and strangely enough, a maintenance man actually came across the suspect after he broke through a roof hatch and was inside of one of the laundry rooms, and our units quickly took him down from there. So he initially started running at 10:28 in the morning, and we had him in custody at 10:38, 10 minutes later. And we could have done the same thing. And it's not that I stress that the UAS is not some magical thing that makes everything go good and makes everything wonderful, but it's a tool in the toolbox. It's something that we integrate into our day-to-day operations because we ran our ground search the same way that we run any ground search. But it took a lot of the workload off of our ground units because with me overhead, I was able to overwatch them and say, I don't see anyone coming out. They must be in the building somewhere. So now rather than them having to worry and watch their backs that the individual may have gotten out of the perimeter or escaped to another location, we have a lot better choice or chance that he's in that building itself.
Okay, tell us about the final case study.
The mission I'm going to go over, it was a very interesting mission. It was rather involved, and it involved a barricaded, armed, suicidal subject. And the call actually began at about 5:30 in the morning when some of our patrol units were actually just driving by, and they heard a male screaming and basically, help me, I'm going to kill somebody, I'm going to kill myself. So, of course, that piqued their interest. They weren't able to make contact with the subject, but it ended up turned into a perimeter situation. We had multiple agencies there, including special weapons and tactics teams. It was rather involved. And about noon, they happened to call me. I was not actually working that day, but they called me because they wanted to have some aerial view of the area. And it actually worked out because I was coming home from a real estate shoot. So not only was I on my way home, but I also had all of my equipment with me, so I had my own personal Inspire, Phantom, and Mavic with me, along with a lot of spare batteries, which really came in handy. So I got there at about 12:30. SWAT team was already in place. Negotiations were taking place. So they said we need an aerial view. So we launched the aircraft from there, and I took an overwatch position at about 200 feet above the townhome. So it's a small neighborhood of townhomes. Most of them are duplexes. We knew the subject had weapons. He had several long arms with rifles, had some fairly numerous firearms in the house, and he kept threatening that he was going to use them. He was going to kill someone else or himself. So we had it up above, and basically we're watching. We could see where the SWAT team positions were. It was very useful for command. Command was absolutely loving it because they could see firsthand where their units were and what their units were going to be doing. Well, probably about a half hour later, we get a call from the guy because he's actually talking on cellular telephone with one of the negotiators and basically says, if my phone dies, I die, and I have 3% battery left. So that was a rather tense moment there. So my commander asked me, are we able to carry a payload with the aircraft? And it happened that my personal Inspire had a Stork device, payload deployment device, installed. So told him, yeah, sure. So we actually took a target bag, because that was all we had at the time, and we put in a phone charger that matched his phone and flew it over to his front porch. And where I was operating from was probably about 750 feet away from where the actual target location happened to be. And I was able to maintain visual line of sight. We were able to drop it down through the trees and drop the phone charger off in the front yard. So dropped it off, went back onto station, and this is where I learned a very important lesson about command needs to understand what they need to tell you when you're doing these types of operations. Once I get back overhead, one of the command comes to me and he says, hey, did you see the rifle in the bushes? The rifle was never mentioned prior to me even getting there. And I said, no, I didn't even know it was there. Well, turns out when we reviewed some of the footage, I actually placed the phone charger about 10 feet away from the rifle in the bushes. But because I was concentrating on where to put the phone charger, I wasn't necessarily looking for the rifle. So the subject, he did eventually come out and get the phone charger, but it took a little bit of speaking with him because he felt that because we placed the phone charger in proximity to the rifle, we were trying to set him up. So that all snowballed into something that just we never imagined. And that's the one thing about public safety is it's always so fluid. Intentions can be taken many different ways. So he did eventually come out. We were able to restore communications with him. And later in the afternoon, we actually started firing tear gas into the unit to see if we could get him to come out. And the one thing about the tear gas canisters is they're actually fired out of a 37 millimeter tear gas gun. And they're launched with some velocity. So we don't want to hit the subject because we could potentially hurt or kill him if we do. So one of the issues we had is he had supposedly started barricading himself in the bathroom. And the bathroom, the window was cracked open. We could see a little bit into it, but the entire bathroom inside was dark. So we couldn't see inside the bathroom. Our worry was that if we went and launched a tear gas canister and broke that window, that we could potentially harm the subject, which we were trying to avoid. I was basically hovering as close as I could to that window, flying basically FPV straight through the screen, and I'm trying to look through that crack, and I can just see in there, and they're waiting on my word to basically go and launch that tear gas canister. And when I could get clearest view I could, I said, I don't see him, I don't think he's there. They actually launched it right past the aircraft, broke the window. So we broke the window. Now we were able to at least be able to see into the bathroom. But the problem is it was still dark. So you couldn't see into it. We had light outside and then the bathroom was very, very dark on the inside. Brought the aircraft back. And what really worked out with this entire incident was that we had two Inspires available. We had the agency's and then we had mine. And what we were able to do is as one was on station over the target area, is the other one would be sitting on the ground prepped by one of my trainee pilots. Once I was getting low on battery, I would call out, okay, low on battery, I'm going to be bringing it back. I would actually have one of our other pilots launch the other Inspire, go on station while we retrieve the other one. So essentially we were able to maintain constant surveillance of the property. And between the two Inspires, we actually had about 4 hours in the air between both of them. So it was a significant amount of flight time. And that's where the batteries came in handy. Thankfully, I had 8 of my personal batteries, plus we had 4 with our agency, so we were able to make it work throughout this entire event without having to recharge. So we brought the aircraft back, actually strapped on a spotlight, because I have a 3D printed mount on board my personal Inspire. Flew it over there, and they were all, he's in the bathroom, he's got the door barricaded, and it was absolutely beautiful to hover right outside of this window with a spotlight facing forward, and my commander's looking over the shoulder, basically seeing what I'm seeing, and there's no one in the bathroom. Turns out he was in another part of the house. Operations continued. We went back and forth, and we actually had thunderstorms start coming in, so now weather came into play. Living in Central Florida, that time of year, May, you can almost set your clock that it's going to go and rain at about 4. Well, sure enough, here comes the storms. We really had to watch it because we had gust front conditions, so the whole weather forecasting came into play. And we kept continuing operations until about 9 o'clock at night, and then we basically decided to go into a sit and wait, and flight operations ceased at that point. So we brought the aircraft back. I went on standby just in case he happened to go run off or anything. But we did successfully get him out at about 1:30 in the morning. He came out of his house. It was a successful negotiation. He was unharmed. Officers were unharmed. And he was taken into custody actually under psychological evaluation. He wasn't placed under arrest because he never actually directly threatened anyone. But it was a very tense situation where you have an individual who is intoxicated. He has mental illness issues that we found out later, and he's armed. So absolutely the best outcome that we could, but being able to really show the versatility of a UAS to not only be able to take pictures at an altitude, but to carry a payload, deploy a payload, and then also be able to utilize other equipment like spotlights to go and get another mission done really showed what the technology could do.
You mentioned communication was a key area. Any other lessons learned?
We had a couple. One of the other ones was the negotiator was not always on the phone with the individual, so there was broken communication. And what we learned was with the Inspire, originally I took up an altitude of about 120, 130 feet. And the Inspire itself, where I'm at, 750 feet away, is almost inaudible. I can't even really hear it. But being over top of the target area, we were actually having issues where the negotiator was having to scream louder. So we basically learned that for those types of operations, you had to pull away a little bit on the perimeter. And 200 to 250 feet was more of a safe altitude. So we just started utilizing the digital zoom on the Inspire 1. So we just kind of learned when you're over top of a house, this is kind of a minimum safe altitude that you want to be at so that you're not causing inordinate noise over top of somebody that's actually trying to do another mission.
Was the Inspire the best drone for the situation?
For that point in time, the Inspire worked beautifully. Now, this was May, so obviously the 210, which is now becoming a staple enterprise for public safety, wasn't available. The M600 would have been much too large, and it would have been overkill for the situation. And we did have a Mavic available. We were going to launch it, but the Inspires were doing such good work, we just kind of kept it off to the side. Honestly, the Mavic for the overhead would have been a much better option because it's quieter. You're able to get it overhead and really not even be noticeable. And plus, the flight time advantage of the Mavic versus the Inspire is a definite advantage when you're looking at 27 to 29 minutes versus 18 minutes is what we were getting on the Inspire 1. And that's actually why our agency, we're just adding a Mavic to the fleet. So now we will have the Inspire for the heavy work, payload operations, speed, power, but we'll also have the Mavic available for indoor operations. So if we have an active shooter inside of a grocery store, school, hospital, we're actually able to take that Mavic indoors and deploy it in front of our entry team while the Inspire is able to go and basically play Overwatch over top of it. So you're able to use multiple aircraft in different roles just because of their different capabilities.
Were you able to tell if the subject's behavior was affected by the drone?
Strangely enough, we had more issues with other people that were watching the event complain about the drone. They felt that we were harassing him. Of course, in today's world, law enforcement's a very touchy subject. Sometimes people that aren't involved in the situation don't necessarily understand why we do what we do. And there were actually people saying, oh, now they're harassing him with a drone. Honestly, he started waving at it when I was outside of the bathroom window. He would come to the window and he would wave, and I would actually go and rock the wings a bit and give him a signal back that, yeah, I see him. And he actually was fine. And one of the touchy situations with this is because he was not under arrest, we did not have the ability to actually just go into his house and take him into custody. At this point in time, because it was a psychological evaluation, he still had rights within his own home because there was a discussion about taking the Mavic and actually flying it through the window and then into the property. The Mavic's capable of it, but we were looking at it from the standpoint of a Fourth Amendment violation that we were actually entering his house, even though it's with a remotely piloted vehicle, that we were still going to be entering his home with something being controlled by law enforcement. So we actually decided not to do that. Now, if he had gone and threatened somebody or fired shots, something along those lines, we most definitely would have sent the Mavic through the window, because then that way we could at least get an idea of where he was and what he had set up inside that house.
You know, I wondered if there was any contemplation of sending in a drone. It just goes to show the complexity of the regulations you guys are faced with in situations like this.
Yeah, just because it's a drone, everything else is still in play. So everything that we do by way of Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, and that's what gets complicated when we look at different state laws, because even states are handling law enforcement use of drones differently. Some states are absolutely free. Go use it. You can go and patrol with it. You can do whatever you want with it. They're fine with it. Florida, on the other hand, we have the Unwarranted Surveillance Act, and that limits the use of law enforcement with drones, that we're able to use them, but there are certain rules that we have to play by. So it's interesting seeing that there is no real set standard across the states. Some states are much more limited. Some states are much more free. It just depends on where you happen to live. And that's why, as a law enforcement officer, not only do you have to understand the Fourth Amendment constitutional rights, but now you also have to understand what that person's rights are related to a drone, especially when you have somewhere where they do have a reasonable expectation of privacy.
When you look at all four use cases, is there a general takeaway that comes to mind?
You really have to treat it as a professional machine. That's really what it comes down to. And it's finally we're seeing drones themselves come out of it's a fun toy that takes pictures into an actual serious tool. And that's where you have to break your administration, supervisors, and the public and show them this is something that gives us a verifiable product. It gives us something that we can work with. It keeps people safer. We're not intending on using it for spying on you in your backyard. We're not going to be hovering over top of your house for extended periods of time. But it really shows that this is something that gives us the ability to keep officers safe, makes us operate more efficiently, and in the end, keep the public safe. So even outside of the law enforcement, when you start looking into public safety, you start looking into fire service, there's a lot of opportunities. It's just a matter of it has to be used in a responsible manner.
For the situations that you described, how many people in your department can fly a drone?
Currently, there are 2 of us that are operational. I have 3 others that are completing the training program. And some of it's just difficult matching schedules and getting them there because it's very similar, again, to the whole manned aviation training is you have to bring them in and actually get them into that environment where they can do that for several hours. It can't be just, okay, we're going to go out for 15 minutes. You have to go out there, and especially what I've created with our training program is very specific exercises. So our goal is to create an exercise that if that pilot flies it one day and then he flies it the next day, he can actually go and measure that his improvement, he's gone and stagnated or he's decreased in performance. So then that way we know what we need to work on.
How large is the unit?
We are a small agency. We're 36 sworn. So for us to have an actual manned aviation unit is an impossibility. We don't have the budget. We don't have the people. So for our agency, we rely on the local sheriff's department, and we are able to utilize their air asset. But the problem is it's based 25 miles away. So a lot of times we're looking at 25 minutes to 45 minutes of a response time just to get them on scene.
And how many drones?
We have one. We actually have a Mavic on order. So we're going to have that as our second. Our primary is the Inspire 1. And the way that we run it is that at the morning, whoever's going to be the pilot in command for the day, they do a pre-flight, they do a briefing for the day to see what kind of weather they're going to have, what they're going to be looking at for the rest of the day. And then they get the aircraft at least semi set up, not completely set up, but it's mostly in the box ready to go. And then they take that with them in the patrol car. It stays in the back. So then that way we don't have to have somebody go back to the station to retrieve it. We're able to go and just pick it up straight from the car. That officer can go to where they're going to deploy from, and then they can deploy straight from there.
Have you developed a strategic plan for how you think this program is going to evolve?
We have. For the most part, my chief is very happy with where we're at the moment, and we have basically laid out what new technologies are coming down the road, what new legislation, and that's the hardest part is being able to judge what are we going to be able to do in 5 years that we're not able to do now. And that's really where the strategic planning comes in, is that with new technologies, new legislation, new rules, what are we going to have that we can take advantage of in 5 years? So when do you upgrade? Do you upgrade right away just to get something a little bit better, or do you wait until the next year when the technology is doubled and then you only spend once rather than buying what you use up your budget and now you don't have the money to move on from there? So it's actually very difficult to look at a long-range plan because the UAS industry is moving forward so fast. You almost have to take it by a day-to-day or week-to-week type of environment rather than looking at what can we do in 5 years, because we can only imagine what we're going to be looking at in that time frame.
How do you interface with other agencies on drone services?
We do fly mutual aid for a lot of the other agencies. And a large portion that we see, the reason that really slows them down is that they get overwhelmed with the amount of information. The only agency in our general area that has a manned aviation unit is the sheriff's office. That's it. So all the other agencies are just like mine, whether they're a little bigger or a little smaller. They are not going to have anyone in the agency that is assigned to manned aviation. So unless they come in with manned aviation experience or drone experience, which honestly is kind of rare, they are starting at scratch. And when you really start looking at this industry and you look at FAA regulations and training regulations and standards and technology and cameras and sensors, it really gets blown to the point where they're overwhelmed with what they're looking at. And we'll pass this off until it gets easier. Unless they have someone in the agency that's actually able to spearhead that and move it forward, we see a lot of agencies look at it and then decide they're going to defer until the technology kind of comes forward a little bit more.
Now, as I understand it, you're also an instructor with Dart Drones. How did that come about?
I ended up just applying for Dart Drones because my wife and I were planning to have a child, and she wanted to stay home, so I needed a second job. So I decided to just do a random search for drone jobs, and sure enough, Dart Drones was hiring. So I applied, and they picked me up in September of 2016. That was when I started with them. And since then, I've kind of taken the lead on public safety matters. So for the most part, I assist in the curriculum development, and then I'm also the chief public safety instructor. So for me, the nice thing is that I'm able to go and take what I've learned in an operational sense and then bring it over into the training world for other agencies. Because again, public safety is so fluid. You have to know the specific operations that go along with what is it being on a perimeter at 3 a.m? What is it when your shift is only half full and you're short on manpower? How do you go and adjust for those types of specifics?
What sort of topics are covered in the training?
We actually have created a lot more of the advanced training. So we still do basic. We teach people how to get in the air, how to use the applications, how to understand the aerodynamics and how the aircraft flies. But then we move into night operations. Night operations is a completely different world than daylight. So not only do you have to understand the regulations and requirements on that side, but just the sheer ability to go and fly, especially safely at night, is a completely different ballgame. So you really have to understand that. So we have a 4-hour course that is specific to night flight. The other is going into search and rescue tactics, because for us, we're integrating the UAS into search and rescue. Not search and rescue is only about drones. There's a lot more that goes into it. So we're bringing a tool, again, into that toolbox. So how are we going to integrate it? How do we use it for incident command? How do you go and get into the incident command structure? Again, it kind of blossoms out into a lot bigger than just about the drone and the drone pilot, because you're simply part of this program, not the main focus of it.
What do you typically hear most from the students that take the class? What key questions or concerns seem to always come up?
Yeah, the largest always focuses around legislation. And again, it goes back to the flying is only a portion of this whole thing. Most agencies are especially concerned about what legislation is in effect in their state, how does that apply to them, and how is it being run in other states? Because we have so little precedent, we basically are playing on an edge where we may make case law. So we have to look at it as what is the best practice that we would do in a normal situation. So how would we handle evidence? We're not going to recreate how to handle evidence. We're simply going to morph it into that. So they're normally asking more about the operational side by way of documentation, operations. How are we going to go and get our people trained? Those are the most common topics that come across.
What do you enjoy most about leading the courses?
It's a lot of fun seeing people come out there, and especially when they start in the morning and they have no experience whatsoever. They're completely open-minded. And by the afternoon, they're actually showing true confidence. One of the things I like to do is payload operations. That's one of my favorites. And even with my open enrollment students, I usually end the day where I have them fly the Inspire 1, and I actually have them do a mock water rescue where they carry a life preserver and they deliver it to a designated target. And it's such a confidence builder for them because, again, they come in the morning, they may have flown a drone once or twice, but they really have no experience with it. And then they realize 8 hours later, they're actually doing a precision payload drop of a life preserver that could potentially save somebody's life someday. And it's just nice to see them really turn on at that point. And then all of a sudden, their mind just really starts going as to what else can I use this for?
There's a recent video from Australia of a team practicing search and rescue operations with a drone, and they actually happened upon a couple of swimmers in trouble. The video shows the drone dropping an inflatable raft or life preserver to the swimmers.
It was a beautiful use. I mean, that is the absolute reason why we do this. In that type of situation, yes, there are other rescue options. There's the ability to go and send out a jet ski. There's the ability to possibly send out a lifeguard. But in this instance, it just shows the flexibility of the UAS platform, and that we can use it for so many other purposes. It's not just something that goes up and takes pictures. We're actually able to do real work with this.
Looking back over the past 18 months, what do you see as the value to your department of adding drones?
It's really brought our agency as a whole as a technology center for many of the agencies in our area. And there's a few of them that are actually bringing up drone programs of their own. Local one happens to be working with Embry-Riddle, which of course is a major force in the aviation industry. And that's where I actually graduated from many years ago. So for them, it's actually kind of works out because a previous sergeant for them now is working for Embry-Riddle and is coming back to train the department. So again, we go back to that whole, the agency has sought out somebody with the experience to come in and then do the training for them. But we have become seen as, for lack of a better term, the technological center of the area. And it's because we have this technology that most of the other agencies don't. And they kind of see it as something that's different and something that's special. Because other agencies, they have license plate readers. They have different types of computerized programs to find people. But across the country, we're still probably looking at under 400 or 500 agencies that even have a UAS program. And there's 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. So those of us that are kind of new at this and bringing this out, we truly are kind of the pioneers, and we're developing the tactics, the standard operating procedures, and the training to move forward into what the industry may be in 5 to 10 years.
Has there been any change in the public's perceptions since you started using drones?
Most definitely. The perception has gotten much better. 2015, I can remember that was when I was kind of at the peak of my flying FPV, and I'd had some instances of myself where I was somewhere minding my own business, and all of a sudden somebody decides they want to come up and confront you because they've heard on the news that drones are evil and they're spying in windows. And especially in the law enforcement community, they're going to be spying on you and they're going to be looking through your windows and your walls. Now, people are seeing drones being used for inspections on telecommunication towers, for power lines. Now they're delivering the life preserver to the boys in the surf. They're seeing that there's a lot of good that comes from this. And on top of it, we're really not seeing the whole mass of drones hovering outside of people's windows. It was more of a fear than it was an actual true worry. And now that it's not coming about, people are seeing that the technology is used for good. They're much happier with it and they're much more comfortable.
And for my final question, Mike, what message would you like to leave on the role of drones in public safety?
For public safety, drones offer the ability to get a perception that we've never had before, especially in a cost-effective manner. They're unique. They give us the ability. And one thing I show is even something as simple as a $99 hobby drone can be used to go and fly from vehicles that are set up on a felony traffic stop up to a car in the window and check that car without having to send human lives. And that's really what it comes down to. And that's what we're seeing with the inspection world, the survey world. We're now able to go and send these machines to go do a job that we used to have a person do, that they would actually put their lives on the line doing it. And this gives us the ability to keep that person safe, get a better product, a more efficient workflow, and still get the job done.
That's it for episode 144 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Mike Uleski of the Daytona Beach Shores Public Safety Department. I want to thank Mike for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about the case studies or want to connect with Mike, check out the city's website at dbshores.org/public-safety. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1 per month, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to patreon.com/drone radio show. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Gores.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.